All right, good morning, everyone. We are in 1 Samuel 18. We have finished David and Goliath. We're going to continue the trend of the elevation and rise of David and the fall of Saul. But in this weird, awkward in-between time where God has already rejected Saul and is no longer with him, and is with David now, yet Saul is still king for a while longer, there's some weirdness for sure. The relationship between Saul and David is quite unusual and prone to some erratic behavior from Saul, and we'll get to explore that as we go. But first, really, we have some more information about the relationship between David and Jonathan. And question number 3 asks about this, and I think there'll be quite a bit for us to talk about. Really, this question should stretch through all 3 of these chapters, so we'll take it in some pieces as we go. But question number 3, what friendship qualities do you see between David and Jonathan? Sue. Yeah, absolutely. So there's this humility of Jonathan in particular to kind of abdicate his right to the throne as far as everyone is concerned. He's the son of the king. He's the presumptive heir, but he's going to forego that. He's going to be humble enough to not push that and not be trying to be a rival of David, but instead to be humble and recognize that God has chosen David to be the next king. What else about their friendship? Loyalty. Yeah, absolutely. There's a level of commitment and loyalty between them that they are tightly bound together. Lauren.
There's a deep love for one another. There's strong language used, or their loved him as his own soul, or he was knit to the soul of David. It was just a very, very deep love bond.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So it is a deep love that they have for each other, and again, strong level of commitment, strong level of care for each other, strong language used about how much they care for each other. Anything else you want to highlight about that? Gary.
I noticed in chapter 20, verse 4, Jonathan said, whatever you want, I will do. It just shows a closeness and a wanting to please. Like you said, their friendship was, they loved each other. And just something else popped into my mind. It just came natural. Most friendships like that.
Yeah.
It's not that you planned it, but sometimes people just get along real well naturally. It seemed like they did from the beginning. They became friends easily.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a unity of purpose and mind here that just seems to work with them, and they're able to keep their commitment and unity with each other. That's good. Yeah.
I'd say it's based on truth too, because Jonathan didn't stay true to his dad when his dad was wrong in certain issues. He stayed true to the truth and communicated that to David.
Yeah, absolutely. A big part of this narrative is that he is choosing David over his father. That cannot have been an easy thing to do. Saul is his father, he is the king, he stands to be able to give Jonathan a lot, stands to be able to be quite a threat to Jonathan if Jonathan's going to side with David. There's a lot of things going against Jonathan's desire to be on David's side and to let his friendship with David win out, yet he does go ahead and do that. So we should talk about the thing that comes up all the time with David and Jonathan do David and Jonathan have a homosexual relationship with each other? What are your thoughts on that? Yeah, okay.
They were both married to women.
Yeah, so they're both married to women, though, throughout history, there have been some who, due to, social stigma around homosexuality, have had a marriage for the appearances, but then kind of a secret partnership, secret relationship in that way. So it doesn't necessarily rule it out. What, Gary?
I think it shows how sick people's thinking can be.
Yeah, I do too. That we have a hard time seeing the word love and seeing bond and commitment and unity without jumping to a sexual relationship. And we generally, in our society and culture, and it's not just ours, but we do a poor job of considering what relationships and friendships we can have that have zero sexual component to them. Aaron?
Well, homosexuality is clearly a sin in the Bible. And the sins that David does commit are recorded for us and pointed out, his faults, his failures. If that would have been the relationship that they had, I'm sure the writer would have pointed that out, and he would have been condemned for that.
Yeah.
Just as he was condemned for adultery.
Yeah, absolutely. The narrator is not shy about confronting David's sins and showing them in their fullness, and it's not addressed here. So, yeah.
It's a ridiculous assumption to make. I have a friend I've known longer than I knew my husband.
Yeah.
And we would support each other financially, emotionally, jump on a plane anytime one of us has a problem. But it doesn't mean there's anything other than a friendship or relationship between us. It's a ridiculous thing for anybody to assume. I'm sure almost everybody in this room has a friend like that.
Right. Yeah. And
Brothers and sisters who would jump to
Yeah.
help and do the things they need to do to help one another out of that love you have for one another. And I can honestly say, when you have a friend like that, you love them.
yeah.
You love them as a friend, but you love them to the point where you're very committed to them, and it means nothing more than that. And it is just a ridiculous thing to assume or make a statement about regarding David and Jonathan.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If you're not poisoned by the kind of sex-addled culture that we have of everything needs to be about sex and everything is the soap opera kind of who's going to be sleeping with who, like. That's not what God made us for one. A sexual relationship is in marriage and an important part of marriage, but everyone else in the world that you're not married to, we're still supposed to show love for. We're supposed to have, bond and commitment to, particularly brethren, particularly these people that we are close to. That's good and appropriate and doesn't have to be anything sexual at all. Lauren, and then Mark? No?
So in verse 14, it says, "And David behaved wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him." And we've seen Saul, like the decisions that he made and what happened when he was in sin, the Lord left him. It would be hypocritical, hypocritical to say that David isn't right in the eyes of God and yet is participating in a homosexual relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Mark?
I'd say the inability for people to understand an affectionate people is their own problem.
Yeah.
And the conclusions are usually for a narrative, and we know that. But I would also say that we see that Jonathan understands God. He says so. He says when he's fighting, he goes to do that little guerrilla warfare. He says to his armor bearer, "Let's see if God's going to help us." He has his faith in God. This relationship is based on God, and Jonathan completely understands that David is in God's plan, and he even says so. Look, when you're the king, please don't kill my family.
Yeah.
Basically asks that favor as part of this covenant. And the fact that people want to know what you're talking about is just foolishness. Because this is just two people who really understand each other and admire each other for what they're going to do for themselves and their families and their country.
Yeah, absolutely. There's an awkward position that they're in here, that David is eventually going to really be opposing Saul. And Jonathan knows that David's going to win out because God is with him. And yeah, what usually happens to the family members of the recently deposed king? They're in grave danger of being executed, just even as a practical consideration of solidifying your power. So Jonathan is respecting that God has made this decision. He's more faithful than his father is to know that God has decided, but this is the way it's going to be. And also, yeah, there's some practical consideration of, let's get in David's good favor so that he's not going to hurt me and my family, and can keep us safe. So Jonathan is acting very wisely here. Nothing of any kind of romantic or sexual relationship. It is much more of a story of how Jonathan does not oppose David's rise to power. There's a bit of a conspiracy theory that is out there among some, people who religious scholars and such, that this has been mistranslated or hidden in order to try to cover up how much of a homosexual relationship there was, as if the text originally said something different and now we've got to weaken it. There's no real argument for that. There's no evidence of anything like that. We see unity and commitment, but nothing more.
Well, I'm not sure, which form of the word love is here, but all of Judah loved David. All of the servants loved David. Does
Yeah.
that mean that there was a relationship between all these people? It's just a ridiculous theory. It's a ridiculous statement.
That is a good thing you've brought that up, because that's where I wanted to go next. That this word in particular that is used to describe their relationship is used in other places. And I didn't have those examples, but I had two others that are used. And I want you to try to put the same conspiracy theory in with these and see how much that seems insane. So in 1 Samuel 16:21, which we just talked about pretty recently, 1 Samuel 16:21 says, "And David came to Saul and entered his service. And Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer." So I guess now we need to assume that Saul also had a homosexual relationship with David. No, clearly this is about in the arc of things that happened with David and Saul. Saul initially had great love and commitment toward David, that David had killed Goliath. David is showing his usefulness and his strength and his love for God, and Saul finds him useful, and so he makes him his armor bearer. And David first has this favored position in Saul's court that he is eventually going to lose just because Saul is rather erratic. Another example would be in 1 Kings 5 and verse 1. 1 Kings 5 and verse 1 says, "Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servants to Solomon when he heard that they had anointed him king in place of his father, for Hiram had always loved David." So now David's got a homosexual relationship with another king of another nearby kingdom, I guess. No, this is about the connection and the commitment that Hiram felt some kind of obligation to David because they had this relationship. And because of the obligation he had to his father, he now feels like he has an obligation to Solomon as well. And he assists in the procuring of the materials needed to build the temple, these kinds of things, because of how much he cared for David. This word, love, all throughout the Old Testament, it has a lot more emphasis of covenantal loyalty and commitment. There's a lot of political ramifications of this in many of the times that it's used, of Israel loving David, being committed to David, and choosing David over Saul, or Jonathan choosing David over Saul, or Hiram having a good, even political relationship with David and with Israel. There's another word entirely that is used for the sexual relationships, whether they're approved or not. And that word is never used to describe David and Jonathan. So we can simply reject that idea, as I think most of us already would. Realize that, yes, the Bible already condemns homosexuality in other places. If David had a homosexual relationship with Jonathan, even if you wanted to speculate that, it is mysteriously not addressed here and not condemned the way that you would expect it to. And David's adultery is condemned. It is not hidden at all in the narrative. There's nothing showing that we're trying to cover up David's flaws the way that historians sometimes do, particularly national historians. We want to make our heroes very heroic and our enemies as vile and monstrous as possible. The writer of Samuel does not do that with David. He gives a pretty upfront and transparent look at who David is, pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses, and we have nothing but good about what's going on with David and Jonathan. Okay. Anything else you want to talk about with David and Jonathan specifically? We will address much more as the chapters go on because of what they're doing, but that will work for now. So question number 4, what does envy do to Saul? Let's kind of get back to this beginning of chapter 18. What does Saul even have to be envious about in the first place? He's king. Why be envious of anyone? Gary?
David's popularity.
Yeah, David's popularity is only growing. Saul has been a pretty popular king for some time, and we haven't necessarily gotten anything in the narrative that tells us that Saul's popularity is declining. Certainly, God is absent. God is not with Saul. And that is waning, but as far as we can tell, he's still a pretty popular king, and he's found some success, although there was some fear, and there were some people who were fleeing from the battle before, but even aside from that, it seems pretty good overall.
Well, there's a comparison made
Yeah.
to their military ability
Yeah.
by the people.
Yeah, it's the comparison. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David is 10,000s. That's pretty clear what the people think. Saul's good, David's great. We really like David. He is a hero. He is a champion. He's a victor. He's the one who slayed Goliath. He's the one who's having all these successes against the Philistines because that's going to build as we go on here. This is what they're saying just after he has killed Goliath. So, I mean, strictly speaking, he's not killed 10,000s of Philistines yet, but he's going to before it's all over, because there will be a lot more battles, and David's going to have just wild success on the field of battle. God is truly with him, and the people see it. So it does not end with his ability to kill Goliath and the people recognize it. Saul is not thrilled about that. He is already paranoid. He is already prone to emotional swings, if we want to put it that way. He already knows, Samuel has told him from God, that the kingdom is going to be taken from him, is not going to be passed on to his son. What does Saul think is going to happen? Like, he can see the writing on the wall. He says in verse 8, Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands, and what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. And this is the twist. We saw David in that very favored position at first, as the anonymous court musician who helped to refresh Saul, onto the champion who kills Goliath, and the armor bearer that Saul loves and trusts, but that doesn't last all that long. Because now Saul thinks, this is the man who is most in position to take my kingdom from me. So I need to keep an eye on him. Tom.
So there's also, it's interesting in verse 16, it says, but all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. So to me, the emphasis there being before them. So it's almost like David was more of a man of the people. So they recognized him and the accomplishments that he did. And Saul kind of, at this point, was already being separate. He maybe saw himself more as like a king and not of the people.
Yeah. And we know that Saul was dealing with the paranoia and the mood swings and the some speculation that we have about maybe some kind of, mental illness maybe at this point, if not diagnosable, the kinds of symptoms of it. It's not hard to see how he might be removing himself from the people. And certainly, even if Saul was not trying to do that, the people interpret this as David is much more of a man of the people. David is the champion that they love. And so, he sticks out compared to Saul. Aaron.
The envy of Saul does what it does to all of us. It poisons the heart.
Yeah.
It kind of alters your perception of the things that are happening around you. So Saul attributes things that happen to David to bad intent.
Yeah.
That David is out to get him, that he's working behind the scenes to conspire. Eventually it leads to Saul throwing a spear at his own son, because Jonathan has taken sides with David. So it's pretty devastating.
Yeah.
Of an emotion to kind of not deal with.
Yeah, he's not handling any of this well. He has certainly not accepted God's judgment on the matter that the kingdom is going to be taken from him. And we see him twice attempting to kill David in a fit of rage or paranoia or whatever it is. And we see some other erratic behavior from Saul. Betty?
What Aaron just talked about, the fear and everything, he hatched a plan to have David marry his daughters,
Yeah.
just to be a snare, so he thought he could go from his daughters to get to David.
Yeah. Let's talk about that, because there's quite a bit that happens with that. Okay, so starting in verse 17 of chapter 18, Saul offers to David his eldest daughter so that David can marry into the family. By this point, we already know that Saul hates David, is afraid of David, probably would rather have him dead. He's not tried to kill David yet, but it's coming soon. Why would he offer his daughter to David?
You can't beat him, join him.
Yeah, I think there's some level of that. Yeah, can't beat him, join him. Keep your enemies close, right? Your friends close and your enemies closer. Saul wants to keep David around and believes that, I think as Betty was saying, that he can use his daughter in order to pose some kind of snare for David. Mark?
One of the conditions was that he would fight battles for the daughter, and we see later what he meant by that. I'm going to put you in a battle that's going to kill you.
Yeah. Okay, so we see that as well, that Saul wants to find an excuse to keep getting David out into battle over and over. Surely he can't stay alive in all of them. Let's put him in more and more dangerous situations because he says there in verse 17, let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. David is too popular to just execute. That would be an insane thing to do because the people would likely revolt. He is the national hero. You can't just kill off national heroes. But if he dies in battle, well, what a tragedy. We'll never get over it. That's Saul's thought, that it would be better if David could just die in battle. But David just won't die in battle, will he? He keeps having successes. He keeps doing very well, and he is victorious again and again. What is the other reason? There is another reason why Saul offers his daughter to David. Okay?
Wasn't it one of the things that he was going to do for whoever killed Goliath?
Yes. So he has kind of already promised to do this. So really, it's already a little strange that Saul is asking for more proof of valor or more of a price like this, because the price was killing Goliath, and David did that. Now, some amount of time has passed. We don't know just exactly how much. Again, with the understanding that David seems to be pretty young, there may have been a little bit of the delay in waiting for him to be just a little bit older for that to work. Saw one timeline that puts David at about 18 or 19 years old when he kills Goliath, and that is old enough for him to be taking the responsibility that he was, but under the age of typically accepted adult status in Israel of about age 20. That could explain why David was not in the army at the time, not being of an age where he could do such a thing. I find that age pretty compelling to think that he was probably right around that. And so quite possible that they're waiting for him just to get, that year or two older in order to marry Saul's daughter. Also, Saul's just erratic in general, so, there's lots of reasons why this could have been delayed a bit. But he has some pressure to offer David his daughter because he has promised this already, and the people know that. That was a public promise. And the more popular David gets, the more people are going to be upset about that being taken from him. But maybe we can encourage David to go show his worthiness again. Let's fight the Philistines some more. Let's be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles, as Saul says. People love to invoke the name of God for their own purposes. Saul doesn't care one whit about the Lord's battles at this point, but David does, and so he's happy to use that in order to manipulate David. So David is successful in battle. But what ends up happening with this eldest daughter of Saul? Yeah, Saul just gives her to someone else. No real reason given here, but pretty easy to speculate. He doesn't really want to give a daughter to David, and he's just kind of being, bouncing all over the place as he's been doing. Mark?
Yeah, when I read verse 18, David's response was, "What is my life and my father's family in Israel, that I should be a son-in-law to the king?" I didn't understand if that was to him being humble or if he was refusing. It's kind of hard for me to articulate that in my own mind, which kind of would have been, if he was refusing, it would have been an insult, I would have thought.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of hard for me to know what exactly he meant by that, other than he was just being humble. I don't know what he meant by that.
I tend to read it as him being humble, partially because he accepts when it's offered the second time, and that it was like what had been kind of rightfully offered to him. And also, and I'm trying to see if all of the translations say that. There is some variant in how they. So I say in the translation I'm reading in the ESV, the beginning of verse 19 has the word "but," as in, David was being humble and was going to do this, but Saul gave his daughter to someone else. Some of the other translations say "so" instead. So maybe there's a little bit of debate over, was David really refusing or was he being humble? Either way, Saul is not acting super honorably here and is not giving the daughter that he had promised to David. And it is going to be part of his strange behavior. Aaron?
I think verse 23 is, worded a little bit differently. It gives us a little more insight into, what David is thinking. So I take that as just him being humble.
Yeah.
He says, "Does it seem to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing I am a poor and lightly esteemed man?" So the way David still sees himself is he's just a humble servant of the Lord.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's just doing what God wants him to do, and he doesn't see himself like most people see him at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the way that I read it. I think it's the most natural reading in general. The way David is conducting himself in all of this is he's not being presumptuous. He's not trying to greedily grab everything that he can from being in Saul's court and from having some kind of favored position. Even as this champion, he does not take for granted that he should just be the king's son-in-law. And at this time, when the servants are whispering in the ears of David, you should be the king's son-in-law, you should marry his daughter, he says, that's not some light thing. That's not some honor that I should have by default to just be the king's son-in-law. So it is probably easiest to read this as humility. John.
Might be like a stretch, but reading that kind of makes me just think, when we live, we shouldn't be living to be seen by everybody, super popular, just live quiet lives, I guess.
Yeah. And how hard must that be for David to actually live that out? Because he is extremely popular. I mean, what do you do when the entire country loves you and literally sings your praises? How do you not get a swelled head? That's, I don't know that any of us have ever been in that sort of amazingly public position of having everyone love you so much. And that makes a lot of people just become very entitled, saying, I should have everything. I should be a leader. People should listen to me. David doesn't do that. He's not presumptuous at all. So after this first daughter is given to another man, now we read of a second time, and it happens a little bit differently because Saul's other daughter, Michal, loved David. So this starts with the fact that she loved David. She would like to marry him. And word of this gets to Saul, and this pleases him because now there's an opportunity to get David to be his son-in-law. Well, Saul, didn't you have this opportunity before? We're supposed to understand this as Saul's, emotional swings, that he's not acting in rational ways. He's changing his mind a lot. He doesn't know what he wants to do. He's behaving just strangely and unpredictably. So what is Saul's reasoning this time for why David should be his son-in-law? Yeah. It's really the same thing all over again. Let her be a snare for him, that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. So He thinks, I've kind of lost this opportunity to get David killed on the field of battle. She loves him. He would surely love to be the king's son-in-law. He's going to be reckless and foolhardy and want to do everything to prove his worth. Let's put some impossible task in front of him. So even though David is a little resistant because of his humility and not wanting to impose and to presume, David gives the bride price. Saul gives the bride price, excuse me. He says in verse 25, the king desires no bride price except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of the king's enemies. That's pretty much how the conversation went down between, my father-in-law and me when there are some strange stories in the Bible, sure, but that is Saul's price here. Go kill 100 Philistines and bring back their foreskins. And this is all framed in the light of, we're fighting the Lord's battles, we're avenging the king, we're doing things that are helping Israel, but the real intent is hopefully David will just die in battle. And we're not speculating here. Verse 25, now Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So zero speculation involved. That is exactly what Saul was trying to do. And this pleased David. David thinks this is all a good idea. He wants to marry Michal. He believes he can go and do this. And so before the time had expired, however much time he was given, David goes with his men and he kills 200 of the Philistines. He doubles what Saul had told him to do and brings back their foreskins, presents them to the king. Again, just weird mental images here. But presents these 200 to Saul that he might become the king's son-in-law. And this time it works in that David actually does marry the king's daughter, and Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David. No matter what he tries, David survives, David thrives, David is victorious, David is greatly blessed. Everything is going well for David. And even in all of Saul's mighty power as king, he can't seem to make David's life all that difficult. It's like God is with him or something. Okay, so the consequence of all this, verse 29, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continually. So I want you to appreciate how this is escalated. Saul, just not all that long ago, said, I need to keep my eye on David. I need to watch him. I need to see what he's up to. And now he's saying, I'm afraid of David. He is my enemy continually. He is my rival. I must overcome him and defeat him however I can. So things have escalated quite a bit. Lauren.
Just this whole progression, this story is not only just a warning, but just terrifying to think about. It's almost as if Saul didn't fully believe that, the Lord was going to leave him, or his position is going to be taken away. His arrogance just grew and grew. His envy, his pride grew and grew, where he was blinded, from reality almost because of his own, it affected his decision making and his fits of rage at BC, where he was just losing control of himself because he's allowed all of these negative emotions to be left unchecked. It's just something we all need to remember in our lives.
Yeah. So when I read through this, and we have the benefit of being able to see all of Saul's life kind of spread out over just a few pages, and we get to skip through the years pretty quickly. But I think, man, this is just kind of crazy of Saul, that he's been told the kingdom is going to be taken away from him, that Jonathan will not get to be king, and he doesn't accept it. He doesn't humble himself and trust that God is actually going to do this and make the best of a situation. Because there was a version of this where Saul could have said, okay, the consequence is my dynasty doesn't go on. I don't get to pass this on to my son. But in the years that I have left to rule, I'm going to rule well. I'm going to trust in God. I'm going to get the kingdom in as good of a position as I can for God's next chosen king. Saul could have done that. Of course, if Saul had a mind to do something like that, maybe the kingdom never would have been taken from him in the first place. But Saul seems to be blind to the reality of what's going to happen. He thinks he can change it. But don't we do similar things in that God has very openly told us the way certain things are going to be? He tells us what sin is. He tells us the consequence of sin. He tells us there's a judgment coming. And we kind of just blind ourselves and go about our days acting like it's not going to happen. Well, I'm not being any smarter than Saul then, really.
Because at the end of the day, he's not wanting to take responsibility for the sin that he's committed.
Right.
Something that we struggle with as well. Where
Yeah.
we just see the escalation here. He just refuses to take responsibility.
Yeah.
He could have done what you had just said, and he should have. And I think that's the point. God gives us that chance.
Yeah.
When we do wrong, to repent and to come back and expect us, in fact, to make those good choices.
Yeah, absolutely. Saul does not make good choices throughout all of this. And he gets more and more distant from God as time goes on. His affliction and his emotional regulation are worsening as time goes on. And it's just kind of a spiral of awfulness until it all implodes on him and David becomes king. Gary?
And that's why the Spirit of the Lord left him, right?
Yeah.
Would the Spirit of the Lord left him if he had stayed obedient?
Yeah, right. That's because God promised to be with Saul. Okay, we talked about how David was anointed. God made this commitment and covenant to David. Well, the same thing happened with Saul. Like, God was committed to Saul. God promised to be with him. God empowered Saul and made him capable of winning great victories for Israel. Saul was a man who rose a long way in order to become king. So he had great opportunity, but then he lost all that because he made it more about himself than about God. So we're seeing this start over with a new man, a new eventual king, and we gotta see, does David do better than Saul? I mean, we know he does, but following the arc of their lives is important to see the difference in their choices. So then the end of 18 tells us that the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle. This is verse 30. And as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. So we're continuing the trend that what Saul does is not successful. Everything by the power of Saul and the power of Saul's armies and the power of Saul's weapons, like that fails. What began there with Goliath, that it wasn't Saul's armies, it wasn't even his weapons, even his armor that is able to topple Goliath, is continuing here. Saul's army has limited success. Saul's power has limited success. David's power only grows and grows. He has more success, and his name is highly esteemed. Some last thoughts. Yeah, Lauren.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Something that stuck out to me in that verse is like he became more highly esteemed, but it says because he behaved more wisely, right? That's been repeated a few times, I believe, in this chapter. Chapter 18, verse 5 says it, where he behaved more wisely, and it repeats it here in verse 30. The reason that stuck out to me, I think, is because people around us notice our behavior, right? When we let our light shine in the way that God would have us to, it's going to be
Yeah. Yeah, so I had to look at that. So, yeah, some of the translations there say that David behaved more wisely than the servants of Saul. Mine says David had more success than all the servants of Saul, both being very true here. That David is acting more wisely and more pleasing to God, and so he has more success than Saul and his servants do. Thanks, everyone. Next week, we'll start in chapter 19.